You never deserved your dad's business anyway, my stepmother Linda said while shredding documents in Dad's office. She thought his sudden death left me powerless, but I'd been Dad's silent partner for 3 years. Linda had no idea that Dad and I had restructured everything after her gambling addiction nearly bankrupted his construction company. She assumed his will would leave her in control, but Dad had been smarter than that. Much smarter. The funeral was barely over when Linda started making her move. She'd called a family meeting for the next day, claiming she needed to discuss Dad's final wishes with me and my half-sister Chloe. But I'd already seen her rifling through Dad's files, clearly looking for something specific. Dad had built Morrison Construction from nothing over 30 years. What started as a one-man operation doing small residential jobs had grown into a company with 40 employees and contracts throughout the state. He'd worked himself to death building something he hoped would provide security for his family long after he was gone. "I build things that last, son, especially people," Dad had told me during one of our late-night conversations in his office. I was 22 then, fresh out of college, and struggling to understand the weight of responsibility he carried. A business is just numbers on paper, but the people who depend on those numbers, the families, the employees, the community, that's what you're really building. Those words echoed in my mind as I watched Linda tear through his files like a scavenger. Dad had built something that lasted, something that mattered, and I'd be damned if I let her destroy it. Linda had come into our lives when I was 16, 2 years after Mom died from cancer. Dad was lonely and vulnerable, and Linda was everything Mom hadn't been: flashy, social, demanding attention. She was 10 years younger than Dad, beautiful in an obvious way that made men notice her and women distrust her immediately. At first, I tried to accept her for Dad's sake. He seemed happy, more alive than he'd been since Mom's death. Linda brought energy to our quiet house, filled it with parties and social events. She convinced Dad to buy a bigger house, newer cars, take expensive vacations. For a while, it seemed like she was good for him. Chloe was born when I was 18, and I loved her immediately. She was innocent in all of this, just a kid who deserved a stable family. But Linda's behavior became increasingly erratic after Chloe's birth. She'd disappear for hours without explanation, spend money recklessly, pick fights with Dad over nothing. The gambling started: small weekend trips to the casino, online poker games, lottery tickets. Linda claimed it was just entertainment, harmless fun. But Dad started getting calls from credit card companies, notices about overdue payments, questions about charges he hadn't authorized. By the time I graduated college and joined the business, Linda's gambling had escalated to a serious problem. She'd maxed out multiple credit cards, taken cash advances, even forged Dad's signature on loan applications. Dad was covering her debts to protect his credit rating, but it was bleeding the business dry. Dad never told me directly about Linda's gambling, but I could see the stress wearing him down. He'd aged 10 years in too, working longer hours to cover the money she was losing. The company's profit margins were shrinking, and Dad was taking smaller jobs just to maintain cash flow. The first time I really understood how bad things were was during a particularly busy summer 3 years ago. We'd landed a major commercial contract, our biggest job ever, and Dad should have been celebrating. Instead, he looked sick with worry. I found him in his office late one night, staring at bank statements with his head in his hands. "Dad, what's wrong?" I asked, sitting across from his desk. He looked up at me with exhausted eyes. "Derek, I need to tell you something about Linda, about what's been happening with our finances." That conversation changed everything. Dad explained how Linda's gambling had escalated from weekend entertainment to a full-blown addiction. She was losing thousands of dollars a month, money that should have been going toward business expansion and employee benefits. The company was surviving, but barely. "She's sick," Dad said quietly. "I know that, but I can't let her destroy what we've built here. 40 families depend on this company for their livelihood." Dad showed me the evidence he'd been collecting. Bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, credit card bills for cash advances Linda had taken, loan applications she'd forged using Dad's signature. The pattern was clear and devastating. Linda was systematically stealing from the business to fund her gambling addiction. "Why haven't you stopped her?" I asked. Dad's shoulders sagged. "I've tried. I've changed passwords, removed her access to accounts, even hidden credit cards, but she always finds a way. She's desperate, Derek. Desperate people do desperate things." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "I'm worried about what she might do if I cut her off completely. To herself, to Chloe, to the business. She's not thinking clearly anymore." That's when Dad proposed the solution that would save Morrison Construction. He wanted to restructure the company ownership to protect it from Linda's addiction while ensuring Chloe would be provided for. It was a complex plan that would require careful legal maneuvering, but Dad had thought it through completely. The restructuring took months to complete. Dad's attorney, Robert Chen, was initially skeptical about the plan, but the evidence of Linda's theft convinced him it was necessary. We created a paper trail showing legitimate business reasons for the ownership transfer: my increased role in operations, my business degree, my long-term commitment to the company. "The key is making this look like a natural business evolution," Robert explained during one of our planning meetings. "Derek has been working in the business for 3 years, has proven his competence, and represents the future of the company. The ownership transfer reflects that reality." We also had to document Linda's financial crimes thoroughly. Every forged signature, every unauthorized withdrawal, every lie she'd told about mysterious expenses. Dad hated building a case against his wife, but he knew it was necessary to protect the business if Linda ever tried to challenge the new ownership structure. "I hope we never have to use this," Dad said as we reviewed the evidence file. "But if something happens to me, if Linda tries to destroy what we've built, you'll have what you need to stop her." The actual transfer was handled quietly through a series of legal documents that made me the majority owner while Dad retained operational control. To anyone watching, including Linda, nothing had changed. Dad continued making all the decisions, signing contracts, managing employees. The business operated exactly as it always had, but Dad had been thorough about protecting Chloe's future as well. He created a trust fund that would provide for her education and living expenses, but structured it so Linda couldn't access the money for gambling. The trust was managed by Robert Chen, with strict guidelines about how funds could be used. "Chloe is innocent in all this," Dad told me. "Whatever happens between Linda and me, I won't let it hurt her future." Linda never suspected the ownership change. She was too focused on her gambling to pay attention to business paperwork, and Dad made sure she never saw the legal documents. As far as she knew, Dad still owned Morrison Construction completely, and she would inherit everything when he died. The heart attack that killed Dad came without warning. He'd been working on the Henderson Commercial Plaza project, our biggest contract ever, pushing himself to finish on schedule. Linda found him collapsed in his office on a Saturday morning, and by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late. The 3 days between Dad's death and his funeral were a blur of grief and responsibility. I had to notify employees, reassure clients, handle the immediate business needs while trying to process the loss of the man who'd been my mentor, partner, and best friend. But in the quiet moments, doubt crept in. Had I really understood what Dad wanted? Was I ready to take on the responsibility of protecting not just the business, but Chloe's future? Linda was grieving too, and despite everything, she was still my little sister's mother. Maybe there was a way to work together, to honor Dad's memory without destroying what remained of our family. Those doubts lasted until I saw Linda in Dad's office, frantically searching through his files with the calculating look of someone inventorying their new possessions. The grief was real, but so was the greed. Dad had been right to protect the business from her addiction. Dad's funeral was a testament to the man he'd been. The church was packed with employees, clients, suppliers, and community members whose lives he'd touched. Linda played the grieving widow perfectly, accepting condolences gracefully and speaking movingly about Dad's dedication to his work and family. But I noticed her watching me during the service, calculating something behind her tears. She was already planning her next move, probably wondering how quickly she could take control of the business and access the money she needed for gambling. The day after the funeral, Linda called the family meeting. She'd arranged to meet at Dad's office, claiming she wanted to go through his papers together and make plans for the company's future. But when I arrived, I found her alone, frantically searching through files and clearly frustrated by what she wasn't finding. "There has to be something here," she muttered, not noticing me in the doorway. "He wouldn't have left me with nothing." That's when I realized Linda had no idea about the ownership transfer. She thought Dad still owned the company, that his will would make her the heir to everything he'd built. She was looking for insurance policies, bank account information, anything that would show her the scope of her inheritance. "Looking for something specific?" I asked, stepping into the office. Linda spun around, startled. "Derek, I didn't hear you come in. I was just trying to understand your father's filing system. There's so much paperwork and I need to know what he left behind." She was lying badly. Her hands were shaking and she couldn't meet my eyes. The desk was covered with scattered documents, and I could see she'd been going through everything systematically, looking for financial records that would reveal the company's value. "Linda, we need to talk," I said, closing the door behind me. "About Dad's will, about the business, about what happens next." Her face lit up with relief. "Yes, exactly. I know your father would want us to work together. The business is too important to let it suffer because of his death. I'll need you to help me understand everything, but I want you to know that I plan to take care of you." She thought she was being generous, offering to take care of me in the business I actually owned. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting. Linda was already planning how to use Morrison Construction to fund her gambling addiction, probably figuring she could sell the company or mortgage it for quick cash. "Linda, there's something you need to understand. Dad made some changes to the business structure 3 years ago, changes that affect what you're inheriting." Her smile faltered. "What kind of changes?" I pulled out the ownership documents Dad's attorney had prepared. "Dad transferred majority ownership of Morrison Construction to me in 2021. I own 60% of the company. Dad's will leaves you the house, his life insurance, and his personal assets, but the business belongs to me." Linda's face went white. She grabbed the documents, scanning them frantically, her hands shaking as she tried to understand what she was reading. "This can't be right. Why would he do this?" "The business was supposed to be mine. Dad was protecting the company from your gambling debts," I said quietly. "He couldn't risk you destroying what he'd built." The mask slipped completely. Linda's grief disappeared, replaced by pure rage. "You manipulative little bastard. You turned him against me, made him think I was some kind of threat. This is my money, my security." "Your gambling addiction cost the company over $200,000, I replied. "Dad documented everything. The forged signatures, the stolen money, the credit card debt. He had to choose between protecting his business and enabling your addiction." Linda was shaking with fury. "I'll contest this. No court will believe your father would leave me with nothing. I was his wife for 12 years. "You're welcome to try," I said calmly. "But Dad's attorney has all the documentation of your theft. If you challenge this, you'll face criminal charges for embezzlement." That stopped her cold. Linda knew exactly what I was talking about: the 50,000 she'd stolen, the forged checks, the unauthorized withdrawals. Dad had been protecting her by not pressing charges, but that protection died with him. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice was weak. I pulled out a folder Dad had left with his attorney. Bank records, surveillance footage, handwriting analysis of the forged signatures. Dad documented everything, Linda. He hoped he'd never need to use it, but he wasn't going to let you destroy his life's work. Linda collapsed into Dad's chair, the fight going out of her. For a moment, she looked like the broken woman she really was: addicted, desperate, and completely out of options. But then her eyes hardened again and I saw the calculating look return. "What about Chloe? She's his daughter too." "Chloe is provided for," I assured her. "Dad created a trust fund for her education and living expenses. She'll be taken care of, but the money is protected from anyone who might try to access it inappropriately." The implication was clear. Linda couldn't gamble away Chloe's future the way she'd tried to gamble away Dad's business. Over the next week, Linda's true nature emerged completely. She hired a lawyer and tried to contest Dad's will, claiming he'd been mentally incompetent when he transferred ownership to me. But Dad's attorney had anticipated this, requiring Dad to undergo psychological evaluation before the transfer to prove his mental capacity. The evaluation had been thorough. Dad had met with a psychiatrist, taken cognitive tests, and been declared completely competent to make business decisions. Robert Chen had insisted on this documentation specifically to prevent Linda from claiming Dad had been manipulated or coerced. Linda then tried to claim the ownership transfer was fraudulent, that I'd manipulated Dad into signing documents he didn't understand. But the paper trail was 2 clear months of legal meetings, multiple attorneys involved, extensive documentation of Linda's gambling debts and theft. When the legal challenges failed, Linda got desperate. She started spreading rumors around town, claiming I'd stolen the business from her, that Dad would never have left her with nothing. But Dad had been respected in the community, and people knew about Linda's gambling problem. Her reputation had been damaged long before Dad died. The breaking point came when Linda tried to access the company accounts directly. She kept copies of old signature cards and attempted to withdraw money, claiming she needed it for business expenses. But the bank had been notified of the ownership change, and her attempted theft was caught on security cameras. That's when I had her arrested. Dad had protected her from criminal charges while he was alive, but I had no such obligation. Linda was charged with attempted theft, fraud, and forgery. The evidence was overwhelming years of documented financial crimes that Dad had covered up to protect his marriage. The investigation revealed the full extent of Linda's gambling addiction and theft. Police found evidence of her accessing online gambling sites from Dad's office computer, using company credit cards to fund her addiction, and forging Dad's signature on loan applications, totaling over $300,000. The district attorney was particularly interested in the case because it involved a pattern of financial crimes spanning several years. Linda had been systematically stealing from Morrison Construction while Dad covered her tracks, but the evidence Dad had collected painted a clear picture of ongoing fraud. Linda's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, claiming she was a victim of gambling addiction who needed treatment, not punishment. But the prosecutor pointed out that Linda had made deliberate choices to steal money, forge documents, and lie to cover her crimes. Addiction didn't excuse criminal behavior. The trial was brutal for Linda. The prosecution presented evidence of her gambling addiction, her theft from the company, her attempts to defraud the business after Dad's death. The community that had once tolerated her behavior because of Dad's reputation turned against her completely. Witnesses testified about Linda's erratic behavior, her lies about where money was going, her attempts to manipulate Dad into giving her access to business accounts. The evidence painted a picture of a woman who saw her husband's business as her personal piggy bank. I sat in the courtroom every day, watching Linda's defense crumble as the evidence mounted. My jaw tightened as I listened to her lawyer try to portray her as a victim, remembering Dad's final warning about Linda's desperation. "She'll do anything to get money for gambling," he'd said. Anything. The most damaging testimony came from the casino employees who knew Linda by name. They described how she'd gamble for hours, losing thousands of dollars in single sessions, then become desperate and angry when she ran out of money. Security footage showed her arguing with dealers, begging for credit, and making frantic phone calls to arrange cash advances. Linda was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She lost the house to pay legal fees and restitution, lost custody of Chloe, lost every connection to the life Dad had provided for her. The judge noted that her pattern of financial crimes showed a complete disregard for the family she'd claimed to love. But Linda's fall from grace wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was a slow, methodical collapse that mirrored the way she destroyed Dad's trust. First came the denial, then the desperate attempts to shift blame, then the gradual realization that she'd lost everything. By the time the verdict was read, Linda looked like a shell of her former self, the beautiful, confident woman who'd once commanded Dad's attention, reduced to a broken addict facing the consequences of her choices. Chloe came to live with me after Linda's conviction. She was only 9, confused and hurt by everything that had happened. But she was smart enough to understand that Linda's choices had consequences, that actions have results that can't be undone. "Why did Mom do those things?" Chloe asked me one evening as we worked on her homework. "She was sick," I told her. "Sometimes people make bad choices when they're sick and those choices hurt the people they love." Chloe nodded solemnly. "Dad tried to help her, didn't he?" "He tried everything he could," I assured her. "But sometimes you can't help someone who doesn't want to be helped." The first time Chloe called me Dad was 6 months after Linda's conviction, We were at a parent-teacher conference, and she introduced me to her teacher as my dad. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they meant everything. This little girl who'd lost so much trusted me enough to give me the most important title in her world. Morrison Construction thrived under my leadership. Without Linda's gambling debts draining resources, the company expanded rapidly. We hired more employees, took on bigger projects, built the reputation Dad had always dreamed of. The business became everything he'd hoped it would be. I implemented new financial controls to prevent future theft, created employee profit-sharing programs that Dad had always wanted to offer, and expanded into commercial construction markets that had been too risky when Linda was bleeding money from the company. The Henderson Commercial Plaza project that Dad had been working on when he died became our signature achievement. I dedicated the project to Dad's memory, and the client was so impressed with our work that they recommended us for 3 additional projects. Within 2 years of Linda's conviction, Morrison Construction had doubled in size. We'd gone from 40 employees to 80, from local residential work to major commercial contracts throughout the region. The company Dad had built was finally reaching its full potential. Linda was released after 18 months, but she emerged from prison a broken woman. The confident, manipulative person who'd once controlled Dad through guilt and desperation was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely lost and defeated. She tried to reconnect with Chloe, but the damage was too deep. Chloe had built a new life with me, made friends, excelled in school, and found stability she'd never known with Linda. The woman who'd once been her mother had become a stranger whose choices had destroyed their family. Linda's attempts to rebuild her life were pathetic and doomed. She found work as a waitress in a small town 2 hours away, but her criminal record and reputation followed her. She was fired from 3 jobs in 6 months, each time because someone had discovered her past. The final tragedy came when Linda's desperation drove her back to gambling. She'd managed to save a few $100s from her waitress job, and the temptation proved too strong. She lost everything in a single night at a tribal casino, then tried to steal money from the restaurant where she worked. The second arrest was her undoing. Linda was sentenced to another year in prison, but this time she didn't survive the experience. She died of a heart attack in her cell, alone and forgotten, the victim of an addiction that had consumed everything she'd ever claimed to love. I didn't attend Linda's funeral. Neither did Chloe, who was now 13 and had built a life that didn't include the woman who'd given birth to her. Linda's death was tragic, but it was also inevitable, the final consequence of choices she'd made years earlier. The final irony came when Linda's public defender called to discuss her estate. She died owing more in legal fees and restitution than she'd ever owned, leaving behind nothing but debt and regret. The woman who'd once thought she'd inherit a construction company died with less than $50 to her name. Dad's plan had worked perfectly. The business was protected, Chloe was provided for, and Linda's gambling addiction couldn't destroy what 3 generations of Morrisons had built. Justice had been served completely. The woman who tried to steal our family's legacy had lost everything instead. I kept Dad's photo in the office, a reminder of the man who'd built something worth protecting. Morrison Construction was his legacy, and it would continue long after Linda was forgotten. The stepmother who'd thought Dad's death made her rich had learned that some betrayals carry consequences that last forever. Chloe grew up knowing the truth about her mother's choices, but also knowing that she was loved and protected. She excelled in school, made friends easily, and showed no signs of the gambling addiction that had destroyed Linda's life. The trust fund Dad had created would ensure she could attend any college she chose, pursue any career she wanted. On the 5th anniversary of Dad's death, I took Chloe to visit his grave. She placed flowers on the headstone and stood quietly for a few minutes, remembering the father who'd loved her enough to protect her future from her mother's addiction. "Dad would be proud of what you've done with the company," she said as we walked back to the car. "He'd be proud of what you've become," I replied. "That's what mattered most to him." The stepmother who'd tried to destroy our family had failed completely. Morrison Construction was stronger than ever, Chloe was thriving, and Linda was nothing but a cautionary tale about the consequences of betrayal. Dad's legacy lived on, protected from the woman who'd thought his death would make her rich. "I build things that last, son, especially people." Dad's words echoed in my mind as I watched Chloe graduate high school with honors, as she chose her college, as she built the life he'd protected for her. Linda's gambling addiction had cost her everything, but it had also revealed the strength of what Dad had built: a family, a business, and a legacy that would endure long after her destructive influence was forgotten.